In this example, I want to go ahead and look at what comes after the fact that I've created an AWS root user account. So currently I'm logged in with my root user account. This is the account that I use to create my AWS account with, right? So I'm the owner of the account, I manage the account, and then what happens next? So one thing I would say is that I don't want to necessarily manage AWS using my root user account. The reason for that is because the root user account is going to have access to access any of the services in AWS, and that root user account is going to have the ability to launch services and basically have unrestricted access throughout the AWS ecosystem. I don't necessarily want that for my daily working account. Okay, so in this example, I'm going to use IAM, which stands for Identity and Access Management, to create a new user and a group that I'm then going to use to log into my AWS account. So I'm going to jump over to IAM. And you'll see right now that I have 0 user groups and 0 users. I have a bunch of roles and a bunch of policies, and this has to do with the fact that I'm not necessarily good about cleaning up those roles and policies. I have some throwaway things that I do in AWS, and then those are artifacts from those throwaway things that I've done in the past. Okay, so to get started, let's create a new user account. Okay, and I'm going to create a user. The username is just going to be for me, so B. Witkowski. I'm going to provide this user access to this AWS Management Console. And when it says the AWS Management Console, it's actually talking about this web-based interface. So the AWS console that you know. Okay, so I'm going to provide access to the AWS Management Console. I actually want to create an IAM user, and I'm going to use a custom password. So I'm specifying the password here. I'm not going to have AWS generate the password for me. I'm going to specify the password. And you can see the complexity requirements of the password. And then I'm going to uncheck this because this is an actual account for me. If this was an account for a new employee or someone else with the business, I might set them up with a temporary password, either auto-generated or custom, and then I'd force them to change the password on their next login. But I'm going to uncheck that for myself. I'm going to go ahead and hit next. This next step allows me to set permissions for that new user account. And for the time being, I'm going to skip over this step. Okay, and I just want to show you the impact that that's going to have on this user account. So I'm going to go ahead and skip over that. And then lastly, you're going to see this throughout the AWS ecosystem for all of the services. It asks me to possibly optionally tag this user account. And where these tags would come into play is, let's say I was a consulting firm and I had several different clients. What could happen is I could tag each client for all the different resources that they use within AWS, and then monthly or quarterly or however I decide to bill those clients for the different projects, I could run a report to basically say, these are all the services associated with you, the client, and this is why that bill has been incurred, or maybe I pass along those charges and things like that. Okay, and I could do that by tag. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create the user, and you'll notice that it's giving me a sign-in for this user. So it's saying it's on Brian's AWS.signin.aws.amazon.com/console. Gives me my username, it gives me my password. I can email the instructions to the end user if I want to, or I can return to my users list and it's going to tell me, hey, I haven't downloaded the user's password, that's fine. Okay, I know the password. So a little bit about that login process. So if I go back to the dashboard, you're going to notice this account ID and then the account alias. These things are going to be needed to log in with this new IAM user that I just set up. So this B. Witkowski user account that I set up. The alias is meant to be a memorable name for you. It's an alias to your account ID, and it's going to show up in your URL. You're welcome to come in and change it. Okay. You're welcome to delete it. You don't need the alias, but then you're going to have to remember the account ID for the login. I'm just going to copy it to my clipboard. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the file menu, and I'm going to open a new incognito window, and I'm going to try to access that AWS console. Okay, so it's going to ask me to sign into the AWS console. Okay, so I don't want to create a, I just want to sign in. So eventually I get to the sign in, and you'll see what the sign in looks like. I'm actually going to enable the new sign in. Okay, so there's two ways I can sign in. I can provide an account ID with an IAM username and password, or I can sign in with the root user email address. Okay, and I can do that with a new sign in as well. Okay, I'm going to sign in with an IAM user. My account ID, sorry, I guess I copied the whole login URL. It's going to be Brian's AWS. Okay, one thing I want to show you with that is I'm using the account alias here, and I can see that if I jump over to the non-incognito window. So that's the account alias. Okay, so I'm providing that account alias. If I had just copied that URL, so in my clipboard I still had the sign-in URL, notice it automatically populates that account alias for me. So that's part of the URL. Okay, and then I'm going to use the new IAM username and the IAM password that I assigned, and I'm going to sign in. Okay, so because I'm an IAM user, I'm able to sign in. It knows that I'm a new user account. You'll notice that it says, hey, this is the B. Witkowski user account for the Brian's AWS account. Okay, but one thing you're going to notice is that you'll see this error message is access denied right away, and you'll see my costs and usage and access denied. And you'll notice that that looks quite a bit different than the user interface that I have over here if I open up the main dashboard. Okay, so in the main dashboard, you can see that it looks different. I'm not getting those access denied errors in the main dashboard if I'm logged in with the root user account. That's only happening to me when I'm using the non-root user account, the newly created IAM user account. If I use that same user account to go over to IAM, I'm not able to access IAM either. You'll notice I start to get all these access denied error messages. Okay, and that has to do with the fact that when I set up this IAM user account, so I do have an IAM user account, B. Witkowski's here. When I set up this user account, remember I skipped the step of assigning permissions to that user account. Okay, so by default, when I create a user account in AWS, the default permission is that that user account has no access to any of the services in AWS. This user account is able to log in, but that's the extent of their access. Okay, so this user account can only log in and it can't do anything else. Okay, but this is the user account that I actually want to use for accessing AWS. I want it to be the account that I manage everything with. So typically I would think of that as an administrative account. And one thing I could do is I could go into the account and I can go back over to the permissions tab here. I can add a permission. I can attach policies directly, and you'll notice that there's this policy here for administrator access. Okay, so I could do that. What I'm going to suggest, though, is that that's a bad idea. From a system administration standpoint, the concept is that I'm never going to add permissions directly to a user account. And the theory goes that if I have one user account that has a specific job role and I assign permissions to that user account, then it becomes difficult to duplicate that user account. And I think of it this way. So let's say I make B. Witkowski an administrator, but then B. Witkowski is also in charge of payroll and accounting, right? Maybe it's my co-founder for a startup. Okay, so I want B. Witkowski to be an administrative account, but then I also want them to have different access to the payroll services. Okay, but maybe later in the company's lifetime, I hire another person that's going to be an administrator, an IT administrator is kind of the role I'm talking about. But that same person wouldn't have access to the payroll data. Okay, so now I need some of the permissions from my earlier account, and I need um, to remove some permissions so that they're not able to access the payroll data. Instead, I suggest is that I want to create a user group for Biutkowski that is going to have administrative access. So if another user also needs administrative access, they would have the same job role, and I would just make them a member of that group. Okay, so I'm going to go to user groups. I'm going to create a new user group called administrators. Okay, so I think I've spelled that right. I'm skipping over adding users and attaching policies. Normally, I would just say Biutkowski's a member of the group, and that group has administrative access. I'm skipping that just to show that we can come back after the fact and modify those same things. So you'll see right now it says there's 0 users associated with the group and there's no permissions. So if I come in after the fact, I can certainly come in and say, yeah, I want to attach some policies. So I want to attach the administrator access policy. That administrator now has, or that group now has administrative access, but there's no users in the group. So what I want to do is I want to add a user, and I only have one user, so I'm going to go ahead and add the user to the group. So now I've kind of went back to the initial screen of creating the group of what users belong to the group and what permissions do they have. I've done that after the fact. So I've assigned a user to the group. And then if I look at the permissions for the group is administrator access. So the users in the group are going to have administrator access. Okay, so now if I go back over to my incognito window that I have open using the Biutkowski account that's a member of the administrators group, you're going to notice this IAM dashboard when I reload it or refresh it. These access denied errors are going to go away for me. And it looks like I have to actually reload the page. Okay. So now this user account has administrative access, similar to what the root user account has, just this user account is not responsible for the bill, all the charges that would get incurred based on this account. The other thing you're going to notice is this account does not have multi-factor authentication set up. Okay, so the root user has multi-factor authentication, meaning I sign in, username, password, and then it's going to ask me for an additional numeric code. So I'll show you that sign-in process for the root user account. So I'll sign out. And then I'm going to sign back in with my root user account. Okay, so I want to sign in with the root user email. And now it's asking for a multi-factor authentication code. Where that's coming from is I have an app called Microsoft Authenticator. Okay, so the Microsoft Authenticator app is going to refresh a code every 30 seconds. So I'm going to just punch in that code. And I'm getting that from my phone. So it's 936189. And then I'm able to sign in to the AWS console. Okay, so that's the multi-factor authentication piece to this. If I want to enable it for the new account that I just created in IAM, I created the user account Biutkowski. I made it a member of the administrators group. If I want to enable that for that user, I can do it either through the user, so enabled without MFA. I can add MFA for myself. So if I add MFA, it's going to ask me what my device is. I'm going to call it Brian's phone. And it doesn't look like it's going to like this hyphen. It looks like it'll allow an underscore, but and then I have 3 different options. I could have a hardware token or a fingerprint, so physical devices. I actually use a virtual device, which is going to be on your phone, and this will work with either iOS or Android. And then it's going to say, hey, you need a compatible authenticator app. So I use Microsoft Authenticator. There's a couple of applications that we can use. So if I scroll down, here's the virtual authenticator apps, depending on which type of phone and which phone operating system you're using. So I happen to use Microsoft Authenticator, but I've used Microsoft Authenticator, I've used Google Authenticator, I have not used the others. So I have not used Twilio or Duo or Symantec VIP. Just any of them are fine. What's going to happen though is if I assign the MFA device, I can then show a QR code. My MFA device can scan the QR code. And then once I do that, my multi-factor authentication device can then enter 2 consecutive codes. So it wants 2 codes to confirm kind of a match with the authenticator application that you have on your phone, and then MFA will be enabled. Okay, so then I'd have multi-factor authentication set up for this user account. Okay, for best practice, so you'll see I'm getting a big warning here. As a security best practice, we recommend you use and assign MFA. I'm breaking security best practices. I'm making the conscious decision to not use multi-factor authentication because I'm lazy and annoyed by multi-factor authentication. A lot of times I sign in and I don't have my phone next to me, and it just annoys me more than I find the usefulness of it. But it does protect the end user, right? So if someone happens to hack into your account and starts utilizing AWS services, you're not going to see those charges, or you will see those charges as the root user account for your AWS organization. So the multi-factor authentication is going to add some protection for you so that you don't have your account hacked or anything like that. Okay, so I would recommend it, but I am making the conscious choice to bypass that. I monitor AWS enough that I'm seeing, if I start to see charges, I would notice it pretty quickly. So I am taking on the risk of doing that, but I just want you to be aware that we can assign multi-factor authentication and how I'd set that up for an end user or something like that. Questions I usually get is, what happens if a user forgets their password? Well, I can reassign it. Okay, so I can go into AWS, I can go into IAM, I can update the console password. I'm an administrator, so I could change it. Okay, so if I'm logged in with my own account, I can update the console password. If I'm logged in as the root user account, so let's say this administrator forgets their password and they call up the root user. And in this case, I'm both of those accounts, but let's say that there were 2 different accounts. I can go into the root user account. I can go to the users. I can go into this account. I can go to the security credentials. I can manage the console access, and I can reset their password for them. Okay, I can revoke console access. Let's say an employee leaves for a new job or they get fired. I can certainly revoke access as well. Okay, and it also gives me information about maybe the last time that user logged in. Okay, so I am getting that information. So lots of details in IAM. Just kind of a quick summary of what we talked about. So if I go out to the IAM homepage, you're going to notice the account ID. I'm going to need that for my IAM users to sign on, either the account ID or the account alias. If I use that in the sign-in URL, it'll automatically populate that account alias for me. And then once I sign in, it's going to be a username and password, and then possibly my multi-factor authentication credential. Okay, we created one user, we created one group. The group was assigned a permission. So the group has a name, it was assigned a permission, which is administrative access. And then we also added the one user account to our group. Okay, and to further drive this home, we're signed in with 2 different accounts right now. So right now I'm signed in with the root user account, the account owner, and then I'm also signed in with that newly created account And the way I signed into both of those things is I'm using an incognito window. I could have used a different browser. So for instance, I'm using Chrome right now. I could have used Safari or Firefox or Edge or something like that, and they wouldn't have shared those credentials. But the way I chose to do it is I opened up a incognito window so that I could have both accounts logged in at the same time. Okay, and then we're able to access all of the different services in AWS because this user account has the permission of an administrative account. Okay, so IAM is going to allow us to create and manage user accounts within our AWS organization.